Hello everyone, my name is Bill Allen. The history of my home state is fascinating to say the least. In January of 1859, gold was discovered in Colorado. This news brought wave after wave of men and women into these rugged mountains seeking their fortune and fame. In the 1870s and 1880s, railroading in Colorado was a prolific and exciting business. There was a great deal of competition. They all wanted to be first into the gold and silver camps, which up until this time had only been accessible by foot, horse, or burro. Some toll roads had been built that would accommodate wagons, but their numbers were few. Railroading in Colorado was difficult, to say the least. Many obstacles lay waiting. Sheer rock walls with no room to lay rails. Rivers to cross. Tunnels to be blasted. Here at the Alpine Tunnel, some 11,521 feet above sea level, are the remains of one such railroad. Once it held the dubious honor of being the highest narrow gauge route in the country. Originally, it was known as the Denver, South Park, and Pacific. And like all of the other narrow gauge roads in Colorado, it was plagued by disaster, high operating costs, and unscrupulous managers. Ultimately, they all failed, save one. The film that you're about to view, Black Smoke, Blue Sky, is a ride aboard a precious piece of living history, now known as the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, formerly the Denver Rio Grande Western Railway. But more than that, we will learn of its history as we admire the rugged and remote country it passes through. Perhaps we'll catch a glimpse of the wildlife native to this region. Our adventure begins in Chama, New Mexico, and terminates in Antonito, Colorado. We will travel 64.5 miles and reach an elevation of 10,022 feet above sea level at the summit of Cumbres Pass, making this the longest and highest operational narrow gauge railroad in North America. These are the Rocky Mountains of Colorado, the great granite barrier known as the Continental Divide. These grand peaks are home to the bighorn sheep and mountain goat. Gracious and delicate wildflowers adorn these rugged slopes. Clear, cold glacial streams rush down the mountainsides to form rivers below. All these elements combine to form majestic scenes in every direction. The discovery of gold in 1859 brought many fortune seekers to these places of rugged and raw beauty. By the time the Civil War ended, the gold fields of Colorado were a flurry of activity. New boom towns sprang up almost overnight. By 1870, the Kansas Pacific Railroad had reached Denver. William Jackson Palmer, a young man employed by the Kansas Pacific, who was a former general in the Union Army during the Civil War, urged his employer to lay rails into the rugged Rocky Mountains. But the Kansas Pacific would have no part of it. So Palmer rallied supporters of his idea and dream. They raised the money needed to get started, and in 1870, articles of incorporation were filed. The Denver and Rio Grande was the first narrow-gauge common carrier in the United States, and the second railroad to originate in Colorado. On Friday, July 28, 1871, the first spike was driven at the DNRG and Kansas Pacific Joint Depot in Denver. The new railroad's hopes and dreams were high, and a feeling of optimism was present as the narrow gauge rails headed south from Denver, along the front range of the Rockies, over what is now known as the Palmer Divide. At the base of Pikes Peak, Palmer founded the city of Colorado Springs, then pressed on southward toward the goal of Mexico City. In 1873, money became tight, and construction along the Rio Grande slowed for several years. In spite of legal battles and financial troubles, Palmer pushed the tiny rails of the Rio Grande south to Chama, then west over La Vida Pass and into the San Luis Valley, crossing the headwaters of the Rio Grande River at Alamosa, Colorado in 1878. 1880 saw a new surge of construction, taking the rails south from Alamosa to Antonito, and then southwest via the winding and twisty route to Chama, New Mexico, crossing the Colorado-New Mexico state line 10 times in one 28-mile stretch between Antonito and Osier, then descending the 4% grade from Cumbres Pass into Chama, with yet one more crossing of the state line. 1881 and 1882 saw the rails extend from Chama to Durango, Colorado, and up the Animas River Canyon to Silverton. The two surviving segments of the original trackage are located on the San Juan extension, within 100 miles of each other. The Silverton, operating from Durango to Silverton, and the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad, recently saved from destruction by a joint act of the New Mexico and Colorado state governments in July of 1970. Interestingly enough, 100 years after the original Articles of Incorporation were filed. As we arrive in Chama, our trainmen are making ready the double header that will take us to Cumbres Pass. Through the magic of video, we will be able to enjoy the beauty of summer and autumn as we journey to Antonito. We will also see several different train configurations and a number of different locomotives in action, one of which is everyone's favorite, number 463. It's noticeably smaller than the other engines and has a different tone to its whistle. In fact, all of the engine whistles have a unique sound of their own, and each engineer has his own way of using it to send the standard signals for such things as railroad highway grade crossing or a warning whistle for livestock on the track. There are 14 different signals used. We will hear several of them before we arrive in Antonito. Let's find our designated seats. The first stop is the Labato trestle.
Representative of Pat's Board of Hall will be passing through the train, selling an assortment of books. One book in particular which you might be interested in is The Ticket to Toltec. This book
Now, let me tell you a quick story about this water tank at Labato. It was put up as part of a movie set in 1970 and is a genuine fake. In 1989, it appeared in the opening scenes of one of my favorite movies, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Even though the Labato trestle is a very sturdy construction, it does have weight restrictions. So it's a wise decision to uncouple the helper engine to make the crossing. We will be stopped here for just a few minutes. During the summer months, this open meadow around the Labato siding and trestle is decorated with many different wildflowers. Most commonly seen is the Indian paintbrush and the Colorado state flower, white and lavender columbine. Daisies and Sega lilies add to the variety. The original trestle to cross the East Fork of Wolf Creek was made of wood. In 1883, this iron bridge was installed and is 100 feet high, 310 feet long. When it was built, the designers had no idea of how large the locomotives would become. So, when the weight of the engines grew to such mammoth proportions, it became the policy of the DNRG to cross one locomotive at a time. And, of course, that's the policy of the Cumbres and Toltec. From the Labato trestle to the summit of Cumbres Pass is a good strong 4% grade and requires 2 locomotives. Here are a couple of ways to visualize a 4% grade. For every 100 feet traveled, we will climb 4 feet in elevation. Or if the train is 300 feet long and we're in the last car, the engines will be 12 feet higher than we are. It takes a great deal of power and traction to pull the heavy train up this steep grade. That's why we have 2 locomotives, or what is called a double header. The Cumbres and Toltec has 3 classes of locomotives running the rails. Number 463 is the smallest, built in 1903 by Baldwin, a K27 class, which weighs in at 223,550 pounds, engine and tender. This little engine has a unique history, which I will fill you in on a little later. Then the 480 series engines, built in 1925, K36 class Baldwins. They weigh in at 286,600 pounds each. These locomotives were the last new narrow gauge engines ordered from Baldwin by the DNRG. The 490 series K37 Baldwins were originally built as standard gauge in 1902 and were classed as C41s. In the late 1920s, they were converted to narrow gauge and were the last narrow gauge locomotives to be put into service by the Denver and Rio Grande. These locomotives are the heaviest, weighing 307,250 pounds each. This is in sharp contrast to the first steam engines of the Denver and Rio Grande, which weighed only 25,000 pounds, including tender, not much larger than a full-size pickup truck and a U-Haul trailer. This turn-of-the-century photo illustrates how the C41 class number 904 dwarfs the Little Ute, which was one of the original 13 locomotives purchased by Palmer. A brief stop at the summit of Cumbres Pass to accomplish three things. Our locomotive needs to take on water, then pull the train over the hump. Lastly, uncouple the helper engine. Then a nice, easy downhill run to Osier for lunch. Now, let me explain the discrepancy in elevation regarding the summit of Cumbres Pass. There are apparent contradictions in the Colorado Department of Highways survey and the Railroad survey. The Colorado Department of Highways says 10,022 feet. The DNRG says 10,015 feet. Nothing serious, mind you, it's just a head-scratcher. In the meantime, let me show you some different varieties of high-altitude indent paintbrush and some other beautiful flowers that grow at this elevation. These paintbrush are hybrid cousins to the red indent paintbrush we saw at the Labato sighting. Summer at this elevation is very short, so the wildflowers go through their life cycle rapidly and take on an added luster and brilliance in order to attract the nectar feeders that will help them achieve pollination. Some hardy varieties will have flowers through Labor Day, even at 10,000 feet, provided there have been no hard frosts. There are so many different kinds, I can't begin to name them all. But the most commonly seen trackside from here to Osier are daisies, indent paintbrush, or its high-altitude cousins, columbine, and fireweed, sometimes all within just a few feet of each other. Looks like our locomotive has a full tender of water. This capacity will range from 4,100 to 6,000 gallons, depending upon the class of locomotive. How much water does one consume per mile? Of course, that depends on many variables: the load, the grade, and the size of the locomotive. In the 13.4 miles from Chama to Cumbres Pass, each engine will consume about 200 gallons of water per mile. Now, all that's left is to pull the train over the hump and uncouple the helper engine. And before you know it, we're on our way. The first point of interest is Tanglefoot Curve, where the engineer blows off unneeded steam. In the early days of the DNRG, snow sheds were built in strategic locations to help keep the road open during the winter. Tanglefoot Curve hosted 2 sheds as shown in this 1910 vintage photo. but there were as many as 13 between mileposts 329 and 332, most of which were destroyed by fire. If you will notice, the surrounding mountainsides are without trees for the most part. One exception, the dead burned-out snags which were left standing after a devastating fire in 1879. As we travel from Cumbres to Osier and beyond, you can't help but notice the total lack of trees in the Rio de los Pinos Valley. Some reforestation has taken place, and in other areas large aspen groves have taken over where conifers once stood. All the hissing, screeching, and whistles don't seem to bother this little guy. He's too busy laying in food for the winter. Nor does the train seem to bother the migratory waterfowl, who use the small lakes and marshes to nest and rear their young. Just ahead is the Los Pinos water tank. There are 6 water tanks like this one, and 2 that are underground. One at Cumbres Pass, and the other at Sublet. Each tank holds 50,000 gallons, and all are spring-fed except for Chama, Lava, and Antonito, which need to be pumped. The lava tank isn't used anymore, but when it was, water had to be pumped a quarter of a mile. In the early days, steam-powered pumps were used to push the water up into the tanks, when a natural spring or a gravity flow system wasn't available. Because the locomotives use a lot of water, the tanks are located between 5 and 7 miles apart. These tanks were built right at the turn of the century, about the time the locomotives became more powerful and consumed more water. These grassy high mountain meadows near the Rio de los Pinos are used by many different cattlemen to graze their livestock. In late September and early October, they move their cattle to lower elevations or to market by truck. In the days of yesteryear, the DNRG played a major role in the transportation of livestock. Even as late as 1966, cattle were being shipped over these narrow gauge rails. We're approaching the Cascade Trestle. The present steel bridge was built in 1889, 137 feet high and 408 feet long. In the days when the D&RG ran long, heavy freight trains, the helper engine was always placed either in the middle of the train or as a pusher just in front of the caboose. Double heading has never been allowed over the Cascade trestle. In early October of 1880, the rails reached Osier, Colorado, which is just ahead and our lunch stop. You may wonder, as I did, why anyone would want to come to Osier in 1880. Well, from here there was a toll road leading on west, and eventually to the gold and silver camps of the San Juans. It didn't take long for the railroad to put the toll road out of business. By January of 1881, the D&RG was providing service to Chama. The now decade-old railroad was poised to move on westward to the potential riches in the gold and silver camps of the San Juan Mountains in southern Colorado. In taking a quick look around Osier, I found quite by accident another discrepancy in the posted elevation. The sign on the old D&RG building reads 9,637 feet. The U.S. Forest Service sign registers the elevation of Osier as 9,631 feet. Personally, I prefer believing the D&RG, if for no other reason than it was here first. As we depart Osier, the Rio de los Pinos Valley starts taking on a different look. The once wide-open meadows gradually become smaller. The rail bed cuts through hard rock formations. The river itself is far below. The idea of a railroad through such rugged terrain is only eclipsed by Mother Nature herself, who provides the backdrop for this exciting adventure into the past. 1881 saw the inauguration of the 19th President of the United States, James Abram Garfield. On July 2nd, in the Washington, D.C. train station, he was hit in the back by an assassin's bullet. After suffering for over 2 months, he died September 19, 1881. An excursion train stopped at Toltec Gorge on September 26, 1881. The awesome beauty which surrounded the passengers and ticket agents, combined with the knowledge that funeral services were being held in Cleveland, Ohio for their fallen president, brought about an impromptu memorial service here at Toltec Gorge. Later, this stone monument with inscription was erected. The west portal of the Toltec Tunnel provides the best view of the gorge. Originally, there was a wooden trestle spanning the gap from the mouth of the tunnel to the rail bed. Later, the trestle was replaced with a rock retaining wall and observation platform. In the early days of the DNRG, it became common practice to stop here for sightseeing and sometimes picnics. The gorge is about 600 feet deep. On the other side of the gorge is the Cruces Wilderness Area, located within the Carson National Forest. Toltec Tunnel, or the Rock Tunnel, was blasted through hard crystalline rock and requires no additional structural support. The Mud Tunnel, on the other hand, just 4 miles ahead, requires wooden timbers to support the soft volcanic soil in order to prevent erosion and cave-ins. As we emerge on the east side of the Toltec Tunnel, the terrain and flora take on a completely different look. The east side of the Toltec Tunnel wasn't as dramatically affected by the fire of 1879 as was the Osier side. Stands of western fir, ponderosa pine, and groves of aspen trees now replace the wide-open valley of the upper Rio de los Pinos. The geology changes as well. Strange-looking volcanic rocks become more commonplace. The rail bed becomes increasingly crooked as it wanders through this part of the Caneos Formation. The brightly colored and sometimes strange-looking eroded rock and volcanic ash formations of this area, coupled with a dim-engined headlamp, a great deal of imagination provided by weary-eyed trainmen who thought they saw ghostly shapes dancing in front of the locomotive during hours of early morning, brought about the naming of this area. Soon it became known as Phantom Curve. At the peak of the Denver and Rio Grande's glory, there were approximately 1,600 miles of narrow gauge track, reaching as far south as Espanola, New Mexico, and as far west as Salt Lake City, Utah. Out of all of that mountain mileage, only 4 narrow gauge tunnels were needed. 2 of them are here, just 4 miles apart, and are now part of the Cumbres and Toltec Scenic Railroad. Presently, our trusty locomotive is number 463, built in 1903 with 14 other K-27s. Now the K-27 class is all but extinct. 463 and 464 are the only 2 which managed to escape the scrap heap. 463 was used by the DNRG until 1955, when actor Gene Autry bought it to use as a backdrop in his Western movies. 463 spent the next 16 years in California. In 1971, Autry gave the little engine to the city of Antonito. Home at last. It sat proudly on display until 1989, when the city of Antonito leased 463 to the Railroad Commission for $1. After extensive rebuilding, it was placed back into active service April 27, 1994. 4 blasts of the whistle announces our departure from Sublet. This area is home to deer and elk, which I might add are not often seen trackside. During the day they are usually bedded down and come out to graze late afternoon to early evening. For the last 7 miles we've been in New Mexico, but just over the hill a few hundred feet is the Colorado-New Mexico state line. Ever so close, but 6 miles more before we cross it again. Palmer spent time in England, the place where steam locomotion was invented, studying steam power and railroading. He brought the idea of narrow gauge railroading back with him, and put it to work in the mountains of Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah. Up until Palmer, the railroads of the United States were what is called standard gauge, which is 4 feet 8 1/2 inches between the rails. The rails are made of much heavier material. The locomotives and rolling stock are much larger and weigh more. Because of the equipment size and the wide rail separation, curves in the track couldn't be as sharp as what could be accomplished with a narrow track separation. For these reasons, Palmer felt the smart way to access the rugged Rocky Mountains was with narrow gauge. The tracks were only 3 feet apart. The locomotives and rolling stock could be much smaller. The rails wouldn't have to be as heavy, and the cuts and fills along the route wouldn't require as much time and labor to construct. Palmer's original goal was for the Denver and Rio Grande to be the first international railroad, with tracks stretching all the way to Mexico City. But too many unexpected obstacles jumped up. The big money crunch of 1873, an 8-year war with the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe over the Royal Gorge route along the Arkansas River. Even though the Rio Grande won, much time and resources were lost. The Santa Fe wasn't the only fly in the ointment for the Rio Grande. The Southern Pacific had cut across southern New Mexico and then north to Santa Fe, thus spoiling the Rio Grande and stopping its southern push at Espanola. Even though the original goals weren't achieved completely, the Rio Grande was certainly the most successful narrow gauge railroad of its time. The next 10.5 miles takes us through lava fields and sagebrush hills as we zigzag across the Colorado-New Mexico state line 7 more times. The pine and fir forests at last give way to open, grassy, boulder-strewn lava fields. The short, stubby conifers in this area are pinyon pine. As we move methodically down into the San Luis Valley, clumps of sagebrush interspersed with grassy areas becomes the primary ground cover. It's here the pronghorn antelope likes to call home. The Rio Grande soon learned that the handbrake wasn't effective on steep grades, and thus became the first railroad to implement an air brake system. The rugged mountain terrain the railroad system passed through became the inspiration for a logo that read, "Scenic Line of the World." This wasn't a boast, it was the truth. The Rio Grande rails passed through Toltec Gorge, the Animas River Canyon, the Royal Gorge on the Arkansas River, through the Black Canyon of the Gunnison River, then later through the Moffat Tunnel. The rails followed the Colorado River west through Glenwood Canyon. Truly, the Rio Grande was the scenic line of the world. The Denver and Rio Grande helped to tame the West and conquer the Rocky Mountains. Hauling freight and passengers to and from the gold and silver camps was its glory time. Proud little engines with big hearts and heavy loads were run by men of steel through these rugged mountains. Accidents befell them. Mother Nature taunted them, but they prevailed. It's to these hardy men and women who pioneered their way westward that we owe a debt of gratitude. Their legacy lives on with the Cumbres and Toltec.